Hi everyone, and welcome to ArtsFest Online and to our next HoPIN webinar. Presentations are from Dr. Peter Quinn, Chair of the Bewick Society, and Dr. Graham Rowe, Senior Lecturer in Biology at the University of Derby. The event will be chaired by Dr. John Hinks, Honorary Reader at the Centre for Printing History and Culture in Birmingham. If you have any questions for our speakers, please do use the Q&A box and we'll go through them at the end of the presentations. We are recording the session, so we ask for you to not share any sensitive information in the chat and the Q&A. So with all that said, welcome everyone, and over to you, John.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks once again to University of Wolverhampton for hosting our webinars and doing all the clever technical stuff, which never goes wrong. Well, mostly never goes wrong. Yeah, welcome to this special Bewick event. This is the last HoPIN event of this year. There'll be another programme of events, we hope, next year. Look out for information on that in due course. But for tonight, we have a special Bewick event jointly with the Bewick Society, and I'm pleased to welcome our two speakers. I'll introduce Peter first, Dr. Peter Quinn, Chair of the Bewick Society. And he is talking about Bewick and Cherryburn, which was Bewick's birthplace and is now a museum devoted to Bewick's life. So we're looking forward to that. So talks are roughly half an hour and then half an hour for discussion at the end. So hour and a half in total. As Claire said, please put questions in the Q&A box, not in chat, please, because we tend not to see them if they go into chat. So use the Q&A for that. I'll then put the questions to speakers in the discussion session. So, okay, over to you, Peter.
Right, so I'm going to share my screen and share the PDF and go full screen. Up, full screen, and there we are. And I minimize the little pictures, and there we are. So. Thank you. So I'm Peter Quinn, and I'm the current chair of the Bewick Society. And I thought a good sort of way to introduce Thomas Bewick to the audience and to review some of the sort of recent activities at Cherryburn was to theme this talk around the idea of home, because the idea of home has been central to the exhibition, which has been at Cherryburn over the summer months. It's now closed, featuring the artwork of the painter George Shaw. So the title is Home, George Shaw, Thomas Bewick and Cherryburn. And you'll see this image of the poor lad having his hair combed for nits a little later on in the presentation. So thinking about how to introduce this, I was thinking of a couple of things, but this watercolour came to mind as a sort of way to introduce you to things, to the Bewick Society. The watercolour by Thomas Bewick in this rather strange and elaborate frame was exhibited in Newcastle in 1903, and we know that from a catalogue entry at the time. It was then largely forgotten. It turned up in 2011, and as a lot of the coverage of the Bewick Society's sort of help that we did to rescue the watercolour and bring it back to Cherryburn was the idea that we were bringing it home. An ironic sort of idea for this little man who's struggling against the wind and rain. And clearly he's never going to get home. He's stuck out there on the moor forever in this Bewick watercolour. It's probably a preparatory drawing by Thomas Bewick, which is at some point, not long after it was created, was made a watercolour, perhaps by the hand of an apprentice, and perhaps not. At some other point, it was given some odd sort of treatment to preserve it. Hence the sort of textured look upon it, which if you've got a good connection, you might spot on the image there. The tiny watercolour is now in the collection at the National Trust at Cherryburn, and it's been a sort of frequent sort of echo of sort of coverage of acquisitions and additions to the museum. That what is happening here is that objects are coming home to Cherryburn. What would that mean? Cherryburn has long attracted visitors, and it was this image which I found in an archive as a research student many years ago, which first sort of alerted me to the 19th century local artists' enthusiasm for Thomas Bewick and their enthusiasm for making trips out to Cherryburn. It's the menu cover for the 1886 art social for the organisation called the Bewick Club. The Bewick Club was the name for the exhibition society which operated in Newcastle in the late 19th century. It had replaced a number of other attempts to organise an annual exhibition in Newcastle, and in the 1880s and 1890s was a pretty successful annual event which happened in Newcastle. And it was also the focus for a sort of support network for local artists who would do live classes together and do trips out into the countryside. The Bewick Club's menu there, if you can study that for a moment, shows a man working on a canvas or a drawing sheet pinned onto an easel. There is a female figure and a male figure crouched over and working on something on their laps. The artist with his hat on there is looking out towards the cottage, the Cherryburn cottage. You'll see other versions of that in a moment. There are birds, there are, nature is growing pretty wild. In fact, it's growing so wild that it seems to be overcoming the image, which is on top of the menu cover. And there's also this rather elaborate image of a sort of artistic female, which is derived from a now non-existent sculpture in the centre of Newcastle. There was a lot of pipe smoking went on at the Bewick Club, although there were many active female members. The men of the Bewick Club seemed to run the show, and pipe smoking seemed to be one of their main preoccupations. The Bewick Club's trip to Cherryburn, which at that point was a working farm, and at that point was still owned by the descendants of Thomas Bewick. And the Bewick Club trip was one of a number of sketching trips and walking tours by Victorian artists and natural history enthusiasts. Natural history enthusiasts would organise large outings down the Tyne Valley in the 1870s, 80s and 90s. Cherryburn today looks like this. This is a photograph was taken in the early evening before the Bewick Society held its annual general meeting. I'm looking out across the farmyard and to the birthplace cottage, which was the cottage that Thomas Bewick would have known. The AGM was held in the museum, which is a Victorian detached farmhouse. I'll show you a photograph of that in a moment. Graham Rowe, who's your next speaker, would like me to do sort of basic introductory material. So I should remind you that Thomas Bewick's dates are 1753 to 1828, and that Thomas Bewick is best known for his self-published books of natural history, the General History of Quadrupeds, published in 1790, and the History of British Birds, published in 2 volumes in 1797 and 1804. He's also known for his sort of groundbreaking illustrations to the Fables of Aesop, published in 1818. And he's renowned for his tailpiece illustrations, which fit often rather randomly within the empty spaces of the pages of quadrupeds, birds, and in a more perhaps designed way, fables. You'll see some tailpiece illustrations coming up here. So at Cherryburn, the museum is where the objects and collections are shown, but the birthplace cottage, which for much of its post Bewick existence has been farm outbuildings, is not a place which is capable of museum quality exhibitions. It's too drafty, perhaps too damp. You'd have to ask an expert on that, but it's always had a sort of rather sparse presentation. The space has been the location for a number of exhibitions. Most recently, Home is Unspent by George Shaw. This was fifth in a series of recent art residency style projects. Briefly, the Juno projects in 2017, Mark Fairlington's 2018 Walking, Looking and Telling Tales, and Marcus Coates's A Conference of the Birds, which took place in 2019. Cherryburn was closed in 2020 because of pandemic COVID restrictions. The Marcus Coates piece was financed by university partnerships, giving that detail is on there on that slide. But after the COVID pandemic, there was a further artist in residence project. Phoebe Connolly produced Birds, Bewick and Beasties, which included engraving on glass and engraving in a glass house as well. And that was supported in association with the Society of Wood Engravers to celebrate their centenary, which was in 2020. So George Shaw's exhibition is now part of what can be seen as a sort of series of present day artists responding to the place and almost inevitably the art and reputation of Thomas Bewick. Why George Shaw? Well, George Shaw and Thomas Bewick have both exhibited with or been exhibited by the Icon Gallery in Birmingham. George Shaw first exhibited there in 2003. Thomas Bewick's tailpieces were exhibited by the Icon Gallery in 2009. In 2011, George Shaw exhibited on Tyneside and was the people's favourite, really, at the Turner Prize exhibition at the Baltic. Thomas Bewick at the same time was exhibiting with contemporary artists out in Hexham. And for a short time, we sort of conjured the idea of nominating Thomas Bewick for the Turner Prize, but that never really happened. Thomas Bewick and George Shaw exhibited together in a contemporary art gallery in London. This was curated by Jonathan Watkins of the Icon Gallery. Children Riding Gravestones was the name derived from one of the Bewick vignettes. The presentation was quite sparse, as you can tell here, with pages of Bewick's collector's item vignette edition separated from the book and displayed as single sheets in frames. Home is Unspent is the title of George Shaw's exhibition. The title is sort of derived from a line in a poem by Philip Larkin, I Remember, I Remember. George Shaw, the painter, is from Coventry, and much of George Shaw's art revolves around remembering his childhood. Philip Larkin's poem was That My Friend Smiled Where You Have Your Roots, Know Only Where My Childhood Was Unspent. I wanted to retort, just where I started. Larkin's poem is a lament that he doesn't have good childhood memories in the way that he's supposed to have about his childhood. George Shaw provides us with a lengthy sort of memoir response that you read as you go into the exhibition. And the memoir responses in both the birthplace and in the museum are illustrated by Bewick tailpieces. This Bewick tailpiece, The Children Riding Gravestones, is part and parcel of Shaw remembering the fact that his family home had recently been decimated, had been emptied out, and that his paintings were, to a certain extent, his response to time passing the passing of his parents, the passing of an era in which the Coventry Council House was the place in which his family was based. One of his childhood memories is recalled in a series of 4 paintings displayed in the small parlour as you go in on the left-hand side. It's a memory of Sunday walks, stopping off at a graveyard, noticing small graves and wondering what they are. So whilst Thomas Bewick's image of the gravestones had the boys riding on top, George Shaw's are a sort of much more sort of autumnal reminiscence of a childhood memory of discovering that these were children buried in these small graves there. Moving through into the birthplace proper, into the large room, Shaw displayed sort of canvases which seemed uncharacteristically empty rooms. They're based on rooms in his council house after the furniture, after all the personal effects were moved out, the empty rooms. Shaw imagined that visitors would use the not real candles but electronic candles to view the canvases, but for much of the summer there was glorious sunshine and no need to creep about with electronic candles. In Thomas Bewick's memoir, the memoir of the home is a place in which he suffers restrictions, in which he continually wishes to escape. It's also the place in which he's at first told off for spending his time, wasting his time drawing, something that George Shaw identified with. My father also found a deal of fault for misspending my time in such idle pursuits, but my propensity for drawing was so rooted that nothing could deter me from persevering in it. Of my evenings at home were spent in filling the flags of the floor and the hearthstone with chalky designs, says Thomas Bewick in his memoir. George Shaw sort of referenced that by discreetly drawing a bird on a flagstone in the floor of the birthplace. So moving to the museum, there's another memoir from George Shaw, a memoir of more recent times, of lockdown, of encountering the natural world in his own garden, and of wondering perhaps if this is an indication that he should get out more to a certain extent. That's what much of that text says there. The Shaw's images of the bird's nest are in sequence. There's an extra egg and then there's no eggs at all. Shaw doesn't know where the eggs went. Was it a cat? What predator destroyed the eggs? Over on the opposite wall, a history of dead British birds, alarmed that birds were flying into a glass house in his garden, and he was finding them dead in his garden, and making a sort of memorial to these dead British birds in a simple as format as possible. On the main wall in the museum, an oil painting by Shaw, an oil painting self-portrait, we assume. You saw George Shaw a few slides ago. He's a ginger-headed chap who wears a t-shirt, and here he seems to be relieving himself in the forest. To the left, in a small frame, a Bewick vignette. Bewick never exhibited his vignettes. You were to encounter them in books, but there it is on the wall there, of a man similarly revealing himself into his own shadow, in the up against an old bit of wall, a bit of Roman wall perhaps, or just a bit of wall there. Shaw, like many contemporary artists, is fascinated by some of the strangenesses and challenging nature of the imagery of Bewick's vignettes. This is from the History of British Birds. Bewick, who would at times use the thumbprint as his mark, and would use it in the receipt for the Fables of Aesop, for instance, here engraves a thumbprint which obscures a scene. There's a rider returning or arriving to a cottage, returning or arriving home, the cottage obscured by the thumbprint. The thumbprint, we can assume, well, is it a joke? Are we supposed to assume that an inky fingered printer has messed up the image and stopped us enjoying the easy or reassuring narrative that is hidden beneath? Or is it an indication of an awareness of the artist and the artist's sort of interference in the natural world? And there are no clear answers to this, because there's no clear note from Bewick about what this may or may not mean. It's a sort of slippery and challenging image there. Shaw was also intrigued by the fact that nearby, well, it's not that nearby, but a car ride away, Philip Larkin and Monica Jones would often spend holidays by the River Tyne at 1A Ratcliffe Road. The Hayden Bridge, the town where Monica Jones lived, has since been bypassed, and the traffic no longer goes past the door. It's a much quieter place than it used to be, and the house, 1A Ratcliffe Road, has now got a wonderful sort of heritage plaque outside. There's Monica Jones photographed there. And George Shaw was peculiarly intrigued by the fact that across the road from 1A Ratcliffe Road is Mr. George's Museum of Time. Shaw, who thinks nostalgically about time, about his childhood, about the past, and tries to recreate it and recall it in his artwork continually, was quite intrigued by Mr. George and his Museum of Time. Perhaps he was a regular visitor there over the summer months. So Cherryburn House, the place of my nativity, Bewick tells us. He tells us quite sort of straightforwardly in chapter 3 of the memoir about the location of the house and the fact that it was quite simple. It stood on its own ground and stables there. When was it built? I was asked this recently, and no one is really sure. It's certainly earlier than 1709. The first person associated with it is John Johnson of Cherryburn. He may have built the property. The building was originally in 3 parts. The third part no longer exists. It was demolished during probably the 1840s. And the third part was the part in which Bewick had his bedroom. He tells us this in his memoir. And this is John Bewick's drawing engraved by Thomas Bewick in 1781, drawn by John Bewick in 1781. And Bewick engraves the view from there in order to highlight the bedroom window. The bedroom window was the place of escape from the house into the natural world for Thomas Bewick. The researcher who looked at Cherryburn's history in 1995 thought that it was likely that the cottage was built under squatters' rights and that it was then made official by the lord of the manor by granting a leasehold, and that the cottage's use was to give a dwelling close to the coal pits. The Bewicks were the owners of leases on coal pits that they then collected rents from. The farming aspect of the cottage was pretty small. It only sits in a plot of 8 acres. Its much larger neighbours are 10 times that size. And the subdivision of the fields is probably thought dates from the 1600s. In 1995, the archaeologist researcher felt that more work could be done with the documents to try and track the way in which the title for the land and its division had been handled. And the documents are held in an archive in Leeds, and I'm not aware that the research has been done yet. Recently, the Bewick Society was given a mass of documents from the 1980s, much more recently, and we're in the process of handing these over to the Tyne and Wear archive. This has included the estate agent's profile when Cherryburn came for sale in the 1980s, and a bundle of photographs of its original appearance. That's the original appearance of the Cherryburn cottage, whitewashed and such like. The planning for the opening of the exhibition, the opening of the museum, was done with some flair, spearheaded by Frank Atkinson and advised by Ian Bain, the great sort of authority on Thomas Bewick. The great and the good raised money, and there are all sorts of lovely ephemeral things in relation to the creation of Cherryburn. And there we are. And eventually, the Queen Mother came to open Cherryburn in June 1988. Cherryburn was given to the National Trust just a few years later in 1992. The museum at Cherryburn acquired a collection through purchase and donation very quickly, even before it opened. Blocks and books came home from the USA with heritage funding. In 1989, it hosted Thomas Bewick in Russia, an exhibition of book plates designed for the museum in a competition of Soviet Union wood engravers. There's a lovely collection of these still in place. The birthplace kitchen, as first presented in 1988, looked like this. There was a sort of element of fakery going on here, because drawings of the original appearance of the Cherryburn interior had been found. They were done by Bewick's son Robert in the 1840s. They were done as Cherryburn was being changed, when that end part of Cherryburn was being demolished, when his father's old family home was increasingly going to be used as farm outbuildings there. The Cherryburn interior of 1847 looks pretty much like the kitchen that the Bewicks were using in a much larger house in Gateshead in and around the same time. These are both by Robert Bewick. In August 1753, I was born and mostly entrusted to the care of my Aunt Hannah, my mother's sister, and my grandmother Agnes Bewick. And the first thing I can remember was that the latter indulged me. Bewick's memoir, written in the 1820s, published in 1862 and published without revisions or censorship in 1975, begins with a memoir of childhood. In the early chapters, Bewick escapes from the family home. He misbehaves, he runs wild, he plays pranks, he's physically abused by a violent and teacher. He rebels, plays truant, he's then ignored by another teacher who can't handle him at all. And he finally faces the errors of his ways and turns himself around with the aid of the local vicar. Along the way, he encounters animals, birds, human cruelty, and the old communities of the Tyne Valley, including the community of pitmen who are working the mine shafts. Bewick's memoir is a memoir of with a very literary bent. It's in order to display Bewick's coming of age, how Bewick becomes the man that he became. If we look at Bewick's imagery, Bewick's vignettes, the home rarely features. The home is usually a place that people are traveling towards. Interiors rarely feature, but there are a telling few. You never quite know how to take this ragged child's treatment. Is he being mistreated or not? Perhaps not. It does look like a sort of cozy kitchen, and mother does have a clay pipe there on the stove. In the Fables of Aesop, however, this is quite a sort of poor impression of it, but the child is about to be chastised for not reading properly. It's one of Thomas Bewick's late vignettes in that hurried-looking style. Much more with a sense of approval is this illustration from later in the book, in which reading is being encouraged, discussion of books is being encouraged in a rather well-off living room with pictures on the wall and grand curtains and furniture there. This was Bewick's ideal of how a family home should be run. I'll finish in just 2 moments. Bewick, there are Bewick images of the nursery, and this boy is obviously going to end up being a hunter. There are also Bewick images of homes being built, and this is a sort of telling joke on himself, because it took him so long to produce the second volume of the history of British birds. This man has gone off to war and lost a leg, come back, and his friend still hasn't built the house there. Houses are also protected, and often the wanderer, the person without the home, the itinerant, is treated with great suspicion in front of the house. So the guard dog here is seeing off the character with his street pack, and the new house in the background looks well protected and rather sinister and unfriendly, perhaps. Here, the ragged boy is surrounded by all sorts of yelping dogs, and an even bigger dog is coming round the gate here. We know from the gate post that this is a large and local mansion owned by the Bewicks with an E, and perhaps that's a self-portrait of the young Thomas Bewick there. Bewick also advises on the ideal home for an artist. The sedentary artist ought to get out a bit. George Shaw identified with that. We can certainly say he ought not to sit at work for a long time, but to unbend his mind with some variety of employment. And he also, in a sense, ought to live on the edge of town. He should be near the town, but he should also be near nature. And Bewick felt that he himself, in Newcastle, had this ideal situation. His cottage was on the edge of Newcastle. It was near the town wall. It's just behind this drawing of the Elizabethan house by Robert Bewick. And it may be that drawing popping up behind the sparrow there. It may be that cottage popping up behind the sparrow there in the history of British birds. If you want to discover Thomas Bewick's Newcastle, a Newcastle which has largely been lost, and we have produced a leaflet which is a guide to the places in and around Newcastle, and you're all very welcome to come and join us. We often do a walk in the better weather round Newcastle, discovering bits and pieces of hidden Thomas. Cherryburn is currently closed. It will reopen in the spring for the new season. It's a National Trust property, as the birthplace, the museum and the gardens. After many years of telling people that they should volunteer to be printers at Cherryburn, this year I volunteered to be a printer at Cherryburn. So if you come on the right day, you may even see me there. It's about to feature in 2 programs, both of which have a sort of home aspect to them. Look out for the Great British Dig, in which Hugh Dennis and some archaeologists come and try and dig out the lawn at the spot where Thomas Bewick's the missing part of Cherryburn is. You can find out when it's on the show whether they discover it or not. And there's also a forthcoming programme, Treasures of the National Trust, in which some of the blocks which they own at Cherryburn are examined by various people on screen, including myself. And there we are. If you want to remind yourself about who Thomas Bewick is, look for resources for future research, or just want to get in touch with us, and the Bewick Society has a website. I've overrun by 5 minutes. Sorry about that, but that's me done now. There we are. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Peter. You didn't actually overrun because we started ever so slightly late. By the time I introduced you, you were about spot on, I think, time-wise, according to me anyway. That was great. Thank you very much for that. That was an introduction to Bewick and his home background. So we move on to our second speaker, who is Dr. Graham Rowe of the University of Derby, where he is a senior lecturer in biology and program leader for conservation and biology. And Graham's going to talk to us about some of Bewick's sources for his animal and bird engravings. So over to you, Graham. Don't forget to put questions in the question and answer box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll have questions in about half an hour. Great.
Okay, is that okay? Ready to go?
Yeah, thank you.
So actually that was a good introduction, Peter. Given that we had a chat about a few days ago, but we didn't really discuss what we were going to talk about, and thankfully there's virtually no overlap between our two presentations, so that's good. So I'm going to talk about some of Bewick's sources for his bird and animal engravings. As you heard, Bewick's dates are 1753 to 1828, and I just thought I'd start with a detailed image of one of his natural history engravings, because it really is it's the animal or the mammal, really, isn't it? It's the animal and bird engravings that he is really best known for. And you can see the incredible detail there on that engraved wooden block. But I think it's even more impressive when you actually think about the size of the block. So at this stage, I should say, literally, I've nicked images left, right, and centre. So I do acknowledge that these are not my images. Some of them are open access, which I've used, but copyright remains with the various owners. So I do apologise if I've nicked one of your images. There shouldn't be too many of those. But here you can see a wooden block of what's called the tanrek. These were printed, I think they were auctioned off at Cherryburn a few years ago, some prints from the original blocks. But I thought that made a good illustration of just how small these blocks actually are, and the incredible attention to detail. I really don't think I could do it, certainly not now. So there's the size of the block. You can see from the size of the hand there, and also then the printed engraving from the first edition of History of Quadrupeds there from 1790. So you can see the level of detail on the published version, but also you get an impression of the size of the block from the image on the left. It then even puts things into even more of a perspective when you look at an engraving, something like the mute swan here. These are all really small blocks, and look at that incredible detail. And that was from the second volume of History of British Birds. So some more than 20 years later. I think one take-home message that I really wanted to put into this talk is that I really personally avoided Thomas Bewick for a very long time, purely because I thought literally everything had been done. There was so much about Bewick. Indeed, in 1862, Bewick published his own memoirs, so a memoir of Thomas Bewick, well, obviously after his death, a memoir of Thomas Bewick written by himself. But this version, obviously in response to kind of a public interest in Bewick, this version was highly edited by one of his daughters. And then more recently, Peter already mentioned Ian Bain. So in 1975, Oxford University Press published the unexpurgated version, where some of the changes had been reinserted. So it's from these sources, this Bewick's own memoir, that we can discover some of the sources for his engravings. There are comments there. Again, Bewick's fame continued, and so this time not written by himself, but written by Jenny Uglow, published in 2006, Nature's Engraver. I mean, all these things just made me think that Bewick had been really well studied. And in some aspects he has, and this is all certainly goes to keep his profile high. But when almost by accident, I started to look into Bewick myself, I found there was a lot of stuff that really wasn't known. Thomas Hugo published the Bewick Collector, again in response to public demand, a few years after Bewick's memoir was published, and the full title being a descriptive catalogue of the works of Thomas and John Bewick, including cuts of various states of books, pamphlets, private gentlemen companies, exhibitions, races, newspaper shops. So you can see the extent of the material that was kind of covered. So at least there was a preliminary catalogue of Bewick's works. The publication history of the books, of which there were many, not just editions of quadrupeds and editions of British birds. They also came in various paper sizes and different qualities and thicknesses of paper. So in '53, Sidney Roscoe published this catalogue raisonné of the various editions of quadrupeds and British birds, and also Fables of Aesop, which we mentioned before. And then this real fantastic work, taking Hugo's I guess we could say preliminary work much further. So Nigel Tattersfield, in collaboration with the British Library and the Bibliographical Society and Oak Knoll Press, produced this huge, truly authoritative work, the complete illustrated work. So all these things again just made me think that there was not much left to be sort of discovered. But that really isn't the case. So for some sources, it is pretty obvious. There's quite a lot of detailed information. So particularly the Chillingham Bull, or the Wild Bull as it's called, from 1789, frequently called Bewick's masterpiece. It was a work that was commissioned by Marmaduke Tunstall, and this really has been well studied. There are quite a few. There's quite a lot of detailed information. Both in Bewick also gives an account of trying to get close enough to make drawings to create this engraving. So for a few of the specimens, it's really clear where the source animals were and the circumstances under which those animals were drawn and then subsequently engraved. But for others, when we start then getting to the book, History of Quadrupeds, it really isn't obvious in many cases, probably the most of the cases. In some cases, yes, I think it is still. So here are some images from a first edition. So clearly Bewick, we presume, was out with his sketchbook, or we know he used kind of scraps of paper. So clearly for animals like domestic animals, and there are multiple dogs in History of Quadrupeds, there are horses, there's cattle, there's sheep. So for all these sort of domesticated or semi-domesticated animals, Bewick could clearly get close to the animals, and he could get sort of for his sources. And you can see these images early on in this first edition. One says Bewick, again delineated and sculpted by Bewick, so drawn and engraved by Bewick. And then the same on the one on the left, we got B, again delineated, sculpt. So for some of these animals, it's pretty clear how Bewick could have got access. And relatively recently, although this sketchbook, one of the few, or perhaps the only known sketchbook that Bewick actually used, this dates from after the publication of the first edition of Quadrupeds. So these aren't images that would have been used for quadrupeds, although given that they cover the period 1792 to about 1799, these images could have then been the source of some of the images in some of the later editions of quadrupeds. And this sketchbook contains more than 40 drawings, including other jottings and other notes here, as you can see here. So thought to be the only sketchbook that Bewick used, or the only surviving sketchbook, I guess. And apparently Bewick usually used scraps of paper for most of his drawings, for a lot of his other drawings. And quite recently, this sketchbook has been reproduced, so published by Jarndyce, designed again by Ian Bain, the name comes up again, and also edited with a commentary by Nigel Tattersfield, who again I previously mentioned. So you can actually buy copies. I think there are still copies still available. So that gives us some idea of Bewick's kind of processes: sketching on paper, sketching animals that he could access. And then these are some of the later editions. So some of those images could have fed in and informed some of the engravings or some of the text in the later editions. But of course, history of quadrupeds covers a lot more than just kind of domestic animals. And clearly in 1790, when the first edition was published, Bewick would not have been able to easily access a kangaroo. They were incredibly rare in Britain. Actually, I can't remember whether there even was a kangaroo in Britain by 1790. I'm not sure there was. They'd only been discovered, I think, in the 1770s. So I don't think we did get a kangaroo until a little bit later. So where is Bewick accessing this material? And there is an advertisement to the book there. He says in quadrupeds, I'm not going to use the Linnaean taxonomy. I'm going to structure the book in a different way, but he doesn't say anything about his sources. But it seems pretty clear that Bewick's image, one way or another, was derived from George Stubbs' image of the kangaroo from New Holland. So we can see that we can see the original source material. Again, it clearly would not have come from the original painting directly, but this painting went through many print versions. So presumably at some point Bewick has picked up a published print version and then used that for the source of his image. Again, for the zebra, also from the first edition here, again, it's pretty clear that the source animal is from Buffon's History Naturelle Générale et Particular. So natural history general in particular, and that clearly is that zebra. It's the same zebra. Although I noticed particularly that the background's been changed. So again, it's not always easy, even though that is the same animal. Bewick has changed the background, so it's not always easy to make that connection between the image that Bewick's used and the original source. And that was an animal, the Buffon animal survived for a couple of years. It was given as a present in 1761 at the very end of the year, I think, and it survived at the palace at Versailles just for a couple of years, and then it was dissected. So we know the animal actually died, but that's clearly the source animal. If I could just read something here, just briefly. So from his memoir, Bewick states, I began this business of cutting the blocks with the figure of the dromedary on the 15th of November, 1785. So he started 5 years before, and he also notes the day on which my father died. And elsewhere, in the same context, he says, November 1785, 29th, begun natural history with the figure of the dromedary, 2nd of December, the camel, 10th, the elephant, 12th, the mouffon, and then the zebu on the 27th, and then the zebra. So he acknowledges. However, he also then states, such animals I knew, I drew from memory upon the wood, so directly upon the wood. Others, which I did not know, were copied from Smelly's abridgment of Buffon. So actually, he's not using this enormous. So with the original publication between 1749 and 1788, these are quarto volumes. They're fantastic. I own half a dozen of them. I own the ones with the zebra and some of the others that I'm particularly interested in. You know, these sell for enormous prices. So, but it's a fantastic work, really wonderfully illustrated. And it really is the source of lots of images that have been later copied and copied and copied and copied and copied and copied. So Buffon commissioned the work, and it was published over many years, and then supplements were further published after his death. Clearly, it was expensive at the time, and Buffon was unlikely to be able to access this material. But as I'm saying, in this memoir, he states clearly that actually, even though it's the same zebra, the original Buffon was not the source. So he's using the image, and again, you can see it's the same zebra, although now reversed. But this one has been copied from this 9-volume Natural History General in particular by Buffon. So there was a 1780 edition, 1785 edition, and then there was one further later edition, and I think a fourth even later edition. So this is the source of Bewick zebra, not the original Buffon, even though it is actually the same, even though it's the same animal. Another a particularly important source was when Bewick went on an extended trip up to Wycliffe Hall. So the first edition of Quadrupeds had just come out, and then the following summer, he then went on quite an extended trip up to Wycliffe Hall. And at Wycliffe, here's Wycliffe Hall, shown a couple of years after Bewick's visit in 1791. It was owned by Marmaduke Tunstall, who was the person that commissioned the engraving of the Chillingham Bull or the Wild Bull. And Tunstall had a massive collection of natural history, and also he had a massive library. And it's very clear again from comments in the memoir that Bewick really used, Bewick spent a long time sketching the birds and the other animals that are in the natural history collection, and also he used the library and also copied images from books from the library. So that's an important source, and we'll come back to that shortly. Another source of the animals that he didn't have ready access to, were traveling menageries. So it's very clear that in 1799, I mean, Gilbert Peacock was based in London, and he had a menagerie at the Exeter Exchange on the Strand. Actually, bizarrely, the menagerie was on the second and third floors, which meant the animals had to go up and down flights of stairs, including an elephant. So here's Pidcock's menagerie, and it was the second floor and then the top floor. But every year, Pidcock would go on tours around the country, sometimes the whole country, sometimes regionally. But in 1799, Pidcock toured up to Newcastle, and it gave Bewick an opportunity to see some of these exotic animals from life. And Pidcock commissioned Bewick to create some engravings. There are 4 well-known engravings, this being one of them, the lion, which then Pidcock had the blocks and then would use them for printing of his advertising material. But of course, it also now gave Bewick that extra knowledge. And of course, now Pidcock did have a zebra, and it gave Bewick now the opportunity of seeing a real zebra. So that's Pidcock's zebra. So it's now a different image. But there is another version of that image, which is by Isaac Nicholson, who's one of the Bewick apprentices. And again, the 2 images get quite confused. So History of British Birds, that's the other work for which Bewick is probably best known. So volume 1, which focused on the land birds, came out in 1797. So after Bewick's trip to Wycliffe in 1791, and between the 2 volumes coming out the following year in 1798, the partnership that Bewick had with Ralph Bealby, they broke up and they went their separate ways. So when the second volume came out, Bewick, in theory, was much more on his own in doing this. Although a little bit of preliminary analysis of the text, I can't see much stylistic difference between the text of the 2. So the text of the first volume was apparently primarily written by Bealby, but after they went their separate ways, it seems to me the text of the second volume, Bealby less, seems to be really quite similar. So I do think there's a piece of work there to see if there are any sort of stylistic differences there. Maybe things are not quite so clear cut as perhaps assumed. So volume 2 focusing on the water birds. But some of the water birds, some of the land birds, and some of the water birds, again, they clearly now have their origins from the trip to Wycliffe, the extended trip. I think it was about 6 weeks. He was there quite a long time. making visits to Wycliffe every day, copying images from the specimens, copying images, and some of these, again, Ian Bain's name coming up further time, some of these images, and then compared with the engravings, were published in this book from 1981, the watercolors and drawings of Thomas Bewick and his workshop apprentices. And in many cases, it's clear that it states, again, I photographed this afternoon for my own copy. So here it says great busted, pen and watercolor study and transfer drawing by Bewick for his engraving in British Birds, Volume 1, 1797, drawn from specimens at Wycliffe Museum in 1791. So it's very clear that Wycliffe played, and there are so many references, it's very clear that Wycliffe served as a really important source of some of the more obscure animals and birds that he was not likely to see in the wild or get ready access to in any other way. So here is the eagle, I think the sea eagle, and that's curious because the image on the left is from the 1797 first edition, so that's labeled A here. But for the following and other editions, the Wycliffe 1791 has been added, and that's very clear. So even though this came out in 1797, this is very clear that there's a date on these blocks. So I don't quite understand whether he's then added, because the Wycliffe 1791 appears in the later edition. It's not as if it's on the earlier one then wiped out. It's the other way around. So again, I'm not sure I can understand that easily. So again, I think there's a lot of, perhaps this is just minutiae, but I think there's a lot of things that we really just don't understand. And in some places, this is from landbirds again. Actually, no, I think this may, yeah, sorry, this is waterbirds. This is a night heron, and in a few places in the text, Bewick does actually say where I got the specimen from. So the above figure was taken from a study in the Wycliffe Museum. But in many cases, it's not mentioned at all. For a lot of the animals and birds, he just doesn't mention what the original sources are, and we are rather left guessing. And it's very clear that for a lot of specimens, he really can't have seen them. He really can't have seen them himself in the wild. He's clearly accessing this material from elsewhere. So maybe a few of the gaps also relate to Wycliffe birds, but it's also clear from other written material that Bewick was getting his sources from literally left, right, and centre. Wherever there was an opportunity, if there was a bird or an animal that was new, he would take up their opportunity. So really, finally, I'm pretty much to the end of it. So just a couple of other places that I think are worth it's worth mentioning. So I mentioned Bewick's trip to Wycliffe, but Tunstall died, and then the specimens were sold off. So Tunstall died, I think, quite shortly after, shortly either before or after Bewick's visit, and the specimens were then sold off. So quite a few went to George Allen, who also had a natural history museum of his own. Some other specimens were dissipated, but again, you can see comments in Bewick's writings where he then clearly, even after the dispersal, he was accessing the specimens, Tunstall's specimens from Wycliffe that had then been passed on to George Allen. And I presume George Allen also had other specimens of his own. So clearly Bewick was accessing lots of other sources. And my final thing that I wanted to say that again quite intrigues me, and I haven't had any chance to follow it up. Not only does Bewick mention Buffon several times, either the original or William Smelley's abridgment, he obtained access to this much rarer book. It's a multi-volume book. It was originally issued in 42 parts, each of which had 24 hand-colored engravings. So there's absolutely no text at all. It was instigated by Buffon, although Buffon probably wasn't perhaps directly involved in it. It's very obscure. They don't even know where it was published, really. I think there's no clarification. It's assumed Paris, but that still doesn't seem clear. The dates aren't clear. It's incredibly rare, partly because, as with a lot of such books, the coloured plates, they get broken up and sold off as prints. But we can see from Bewick's records that he obtained access to it. He borrowed the set of these, and he had them for quite a long time. Now, in this series, of which there are just over 1,000 plates, the vast majority of birds, but most of them again are exotic birds. I've chosen to show a lapwing, a European bird, but we can see that Bewick borrowed a set, and you can see postage costs back to London. So he's borrowed it from someone in London, and he had it for quite a while, and then he sent it back again at quite an expense. So I'm quite intrigued as to kind of what Bewick's interest was here, given that most of the birds here are exotic birds. They can't really have been much use in terms of the history of British birds. So whether a few of these images were actually sourced from this version of Buffon, again, is work that sort of remains to be done. Right, that's it from me. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Graham. That was very interesting. Quite an amazing range of sources there that he was using, which was very fascinating. Right, keep those questions coming. I've got one question and one comment so far. Before I go on to those, could I just say that in a minute, when I've stopped talking, I will put my email in the, I'll put it in the chat. If anybody wants to offer a talk for next year, or if you want to join HoPIN, if you haven't already, there's no charge for that. Just email me. I'll put my address in the chat. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks very much to both speakers. That was extremely interesting. I certainly know a lot more about Bewick than I did an hour ago. So thank you for that. And let's get straight on to the questions, of which I see there are now 3. Excuse me. Let's have the comment first. Caroline Cood says, not a question, just great appreciation of the talk by Peter. Luckily, I live in Newcastle and enjoy visiting Cherryburn regularly. Good.
Well
Paul
done,
Bowden. Sorry? Yeah.
Well done, Caroline. Yes.
Well done, absolutely. Paul Bowden says, I live in Darlington. In 1795, a William Bewick was born in Darlington and went on to be a painter. Is he related to Thomas? Anybody know that?
No, is the answer.
No.
So William Bewick is an interesting Victorian artist who also wrote a memoir, which I think is quite a lengthy book. But Bewick is a fairly common name in the Northeast,
Yeah.
and there are also variations in spelling as well. The two other Bewick artists are John Bewick, Thomas's brother, who dies tragically young at Cherryburn, having had a short and pretty successful career in London, and Robert Bewick, who becomes Bewick's successor in the engraver's workshop. And Robert was known for his sort of reliability, but perhaps lack of imagination, hence the appearance of the rather straightforward drawings that he does of the cottage, the kitchens. He also did a plan of the part of the property that was demolished, which you'll see that the Channel 4 archaeologists made use of during the summer, which is quite interesting. But William Bewick is a Victorian artist of no relation, but he is occasionally mixed up with Thomas and his lot in in indexes and such like, which is sometimes confusing.
Okay. Question from Kathy Ferguson. Can you tell us about the physical process of engraving that Bewick used? Well, that's a whole other lecture, I guess. But
shall I do that one, Graham? Or,
Absolutely, yeah.
So Bewick uses the same sort of tools to engrave on boxwood as he would have used to engrave on metal, whether it was your silver salver or your walking stick or something like that, except they do it in reverse. Boxwood is tremendously sturdy material, and Graham's about to show you a piece of boxwood.
It is.
It's a tremendously sturdy material, so it can last for, I think they calculated one had lasted for 900,000 impressions. It was being used in a newspaper. The physical process of doing it is that you basically make a cut, and if you make a cut, then you're drawing a white line. So if you look at the background of the swan there, you can see it in the leaves and the foliage. The white lines have been cut out of the black of the block. The black lines, he basically cuts out the remaining area. Bewick favoured this sort of vignette style, so they're generally not framed. Graham's put a frame on his just to contain them in the presentation. In the books, apart from the Fables of Aesop, there's always exceptions. Apart from the Fables of Aesop, the illustrations of animals are generally unframed, so you get this sort of cloud-like or vignette appearance round about it. Does that answer it? Is that clear? Yeah.
I think it probably does. Thank you very much for that. As I say, we could easily have a whole session on how you do engraving. Maybe we will one day.
There's a local engraver, Chris Daunt, does day-long workshops with you, and by the end of the day, you think you're Thomas Bewick, and you've made an engraving. You then go home and try it yourself, and you realise that Chris has done most of it. But there we are.
Yeah, and just to clarify for those who are not so clued up on this, we're talking about wood engraving here, not wood cut, which is a different process going along the grain, isn't it? Wood engravings on the end grain, is that right? And
so the boxwood is tremendously hard because they're using that part of the wood which is densely it grows densely together. So you're basically cutting it on the hardest part of it, so it doesn't fracture or break up in the way that you would see, say, in a wood cut by Edvard Munch, for instance, which always looks like sort of old planks or whatever. You don't get any of that woody appearance at all.
No, quite different, isn't it? Okay, thanks very much for that. A bit of a tongue-in-cheek question here, I think, from one David. I recall reading either in the memoir or in Nature's Engraver that Bewick had people post specimens to him. I wonder how they smelt on arrival. Good question. Anybody know?
So Graham, isn't there there's a vicar who keeps sending Bewick old crows that he's cleared out of the and Bewick does a wonderful crow at the beginning. He doesn't need to see anymore. But there are a number of birds that and often there are birds which have sort of landed in the south of England that the Bewick doesn't know about, doesn't see, and some of those he gets dead specimens sent to him, and some of them they're drawings, aren't they? Is that right?
I remember that certainly there was a market, wasn't there, in London? That the name slips my memory at the moment, but there was a very famous market that really sort of traded in a lot of dead birds, a lot of exotic material, and I think that really was a very common source for lots of natural historians. Right. I think they all around the country, I think they literally paid people in London to keep an eye out for any bird that sort of came through the market that wasn't previously known.
Right. That's interesting. The other oddity about the text is that occasionally they do discuss what a bird may or may not taste like and whether it's good to eat. which is not the sort of thing you imagine you're going to encounter in an ornithological guide, but they're sort of making it up as they go along at the beginning of this genre, I think, to a certain extent.
I don't think that was that uncommon. I mean, it was well known that Charles Darwin was part of a dinner club, wasn't he? That they were eating all sorts of exotic animals.
Right. Yeah.
And also there's a book actually called The Man That Ate the Zoo. Because I think he was working at London Zoo, and I think they literally, when things died, they were sort of eating their way through. They were trying out all sorts of things. So,
right.
I think it was perhaps less common now, but I think it was fairly common then.
Right.
Eat your way through the things.
Is that why the dodo went up on the menu?
Apparently, the dodo was very poor eating, is my understanding. Because it was very fatty. Yeah, it was frequently used. They boiled it down for the oil for candles. Apparently, the meat was very poor.
Not part of the healthy diet. Right, where are we? I've done these out of order, so I'm right. Now, wait a minute, bear with me. Question from Heather. Hello all, thanks for the talk. Is there still a large collection of Bewick's blocks in Newcastle City Central Library? They used to house about 900 blocks. Also, the Hancock Museum had some information on display at one time. Nice, because Bewick has not really been given the accolade he should have. P.S. I printed many of the blocks at Charlotte Press in the late 1980s for their archive. Also, Bewick's memoirs, well worth a read for their historic account of northeastern England in particular.
Yes. So so the block collections, there's a page on our website which gives you the details of them all. The main one is at Newcastle City Library, and that for any researcher, that's an essential collection to visit. The Natural History Society of Northumbria, which now operates out of its archive and library at the back of what used to be called the Hancock Museum and is now called Great Museum of the North, Hancock, is also a key place, a key resource. The Newcastle display, where you could walk up and be guaranteed to see a display in a museum relating to Thomas Bewick, is now at the Laying Art Gallery. At various times it's been in various other parts of the Tiny Weird museums, but now he greets you as you arrive into the display of local art on the ground floor of the Laying Art Gallery, and that includes dummy blocks as well that you can handle to get an idea of what a wood block is like. We are keen, if there are any curators or people in power in the museum world listening in out there in Zoom land, we are keen to organise future exhibitions and retrospectives. The last major proper retrospective of Thomas Bewick was held in 1978. 1978, it was launched at the same time that Scotland were in the World Cup. It's so long ago, and please think about how we might right that wrong. 1828 to 2028 will be an important anniversary, and it would be quite nice to mark it with a retrospective, but we need to get going soon in order to do that. Yeah,
that's true. It takes a while to organise these things, doesn't it?
It does.
Right, there's a few people saying thank you for a very interesting talk, etc. Are there any more actual
Bewick blocks do actually come up for sale occasionally. A few years ago, on eBay, a few years ago, I bid for the published block of the blue tit, and also I think it was the marsh tit. They were selling them as a pair. It didn't go at an enormous price. I mean, it went for several £100s. It got to the stage where, maybe I bid about £600, and then thought, oh, really, I shouldn't really, I could probably better spend the money on something else. But I think I was probably the second highest bidder, so I didn't win it. But I don't think it went for much more than that.
Thank you. Right, people saying thank you. There's one question from Ali. I'd be happy to hear more about Bewick's network of naturalists who provided him with specimens and books and his connections in France. Any more on that, Graham? Is that one for another time, maybe?
I think he had a wide connection of
Right.
I think there were a lot of contacts, but I'm not sure there were any other particular main one. And certainly George Allen was an important contact. But so Thomas Pennant also, the naturalist Thomas Pennant.
So about France, so France has got an interesting sort of example because Bewick is using a French published text. But France, for much of the period that Bewick is working, is not a place that you can have any contact with because at the time of the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars. So he's sort of walled out of France. And we do know that there were plans to translate the history of British birds into German. There was quite an appreciation of Bewick in Germany, and that's something. I don't speak German. I would really like someone to do a little bit more research on. Nigel Tattersfield has done an amount, and we really need to sort of pin it down a little bit more, because in some of the Bewick vignettes, you see characteristic romantic imagery, which would chime with the German art of the period. The other interesting thing in relation to France is that the 1980s published book by the art historians Rosen and Zerner has a chapter on Thomas Bewick as an archetypal romantic artist based on his production of the vignettes. And that's alongside studies of French illustration and French artists such as Courbet and such like are mentioned in the book. The other connection with France is that on my bookshelf over there, I have a history of wood engraving written by Remy Blanchon, which is a 21st century history of wood engraving. And we know that there are indirect connections with Thomas Bewick, which basically bring wood engraving to the French. The French start wood engraving on a mass scale after the English do, because they're late with adopting the technology. And Bewick's sort of role as a sort of exemplar of the way in which wood engraving can be used in the production of reasonably priced but actually surprisingly good quality books is part and parcel of that story. So he does have an indirect role in the history of wood engraving and illustration in France. The book on my, it's one of the few books on my bookshelf which is entirely in French. So yeah, so there we are. Remy Blanchon's History of Wood Engraving.
Peter mentioned some Russian wood engravings. But again, Peter knows that was it probably last year now. I bought a pamphlet published in the early 20th century, completely in Russian. It was a Russian mini biography of Thomas Bewick. So clearly, clearly there was that knowledge, that interest, even extending right the way through to Russia by the early 20th century.
So one of my ambitions is to do a global Bewick. So the memoir was translated into both Danish and Swedish, and there are 20th century paperback versions of the memoir in Danish and Swedish. Thomas Bewick appears in the background of film titles designed by the Californian Hollywood-based film title design specialist Saul Bass. Which is, and the other aspect of Bewick is that several Japanese scholars have been interested in correlations between wood engraving and Japanese woodcut, and the very different technology of the two. So that there have been publications in Japanese on Thomas Bewick as well. So there's a whole global world of Thomas Bewick out there to explore.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't realised that he had this international reputation, despite being somebody I regard as a quintessentially English or British artist.
Ah, right. Yeah, no, that's another question. I'm quite interested, for obvious reasons, I'm quite interested in Thomas Bewick's enthusiasm for and the importance of Scotland in relation to what he does, and his relationship with the Scottish art history and the Scottish visual culture, which in many ways is much more understandable than his relationship with smart, posh London culture, which he was very wary of, and also which, to a certain extent, is wary of him as well. So it's another subject.
Did he travel in Scotland at all? Yeah.
Well, there's a chapter of his book where he has his year away, so he has a summer away where he literally wanders the Highlands. And it's a wonderful chapter, and it makes him, and in the book, it's the sort of culmination of how he becomes a man. So there you are. Women are involved, but there we are. Don't rush to the bookshops on that basis only. But it's metaphoric rather than actual. But it's an intriguing point in his story. He revisits Scotland again for his 70th birthday. So he goes there as a young man in his 20s, and he revisits as a 70-year-old. But there are Scottish connections in between, which are really quite intriguing, including Bewick's illustration of Scottish poetry and his enthusiasm for Scottish poetry as well. So there we are, more global Bewick.
Yeah, and Bewick's reputation certainly crossed the Atlantic, because when he was in Scotland, Audubon came to Scotland and actually rooted out Thomas Bewick, and he visited him at home. So clearly, Audubon, one of the world's most famous bird artists, actually rooted Thomas Bewick out. So clearly his reputation had reached America, or certainly reached Audubon in America. And then when Audubon returned to America, he produced a big play called put my teeth in. He produced a plate of a wren, and he labelled it Bewick's wren. So it's not even a species that's found in Europe. So there is an American wren called Bewick's wren in Thomas's honour.
Oh, right. Well, you've actually answered a question without knowing it. Heather said, pretty sure that Audubon used Bewick's engravings as a resource. In fact, they may have met. Well, I confirmed that.
They certainly have met. Yeah,
certainly. So Audubon is such a different artist to Bewick's, and it's almost as if he's living in a different sort of visual world, a different visual realm. Audubon's imagery are always full of struggle and difficulty for his animals, whereas Bewick's imagery always seems much more sort of serene and withdrawn from the struggle for survival, which is part of the appeal of Bewick's imagery, I think. Yeah.
And also there's quite a time gap as well, isn't there? Because wasn't it 1826 when Audubon was so really right at the very end of Bewick's life. So they met, but they are effectively sort of two different time periods. So I suppose there's quite a lot of the philosophy of art and the imagery. I guess that's changed as well over that time.
So, and also talking about source material, Bewick's quadrupeds becomes the source material for the very first wood engraved illustrated book produced in America, which is Bewick's Quadrupeds, done by Alexander Anderson. He basically copies the book, and he teaches himself to wood engrave by copying Thomas Bewick's Quadrupeds, and then Anderson becomes the premier wood engraver based in New York of American wood engraving. He's the sort of launching point. He doesn't produce a version of British birds, but we do know that copies of British birds went to America as well. And I'm also intrigued by the Audubon's rival, Alexander Wilson. So Alexander Wilson is the sort of foundation stone of American natural history illustration. He's a radical from Paisley who basically flees persecution in Britain and becomes this sort of illustrator artist at the beginning of natural history in America. And his knowledge or otherwise of Bewick, I would like someone to investigate that. I think that's something of interest. You know?
Yeah, I think that was one of the points I really wanted just to get across, that there is quite a lot known, but there's a lot of context that isn't known. I think there's so much more that's still to be done.
Yeah.
So even though perhaps publication dates and things of books and various versions, is known in detail, there's a huge amount of context about the images and the sources and the contacts, the social circle that really is. There's still an awful lot to do.
Plenty of work there. Several PhDs there. By the
Absolutely.
And if anybody feels inclined to do so. I had a question myself. There was a mention of one of the publications you showed us. I forget which of you showed it now. Of Bewick and his assistants or something. Did he have a large workshop? Did he have apprentices? How much of it was him and how much of it was the workshop?
That's for Peter to answer.
So in total, he had 30 apprentices.
Ooh.
He writes in the memoir that he thought long and hard about taking any of them on. One of the things that was censored out of the memoir was the fact that he had a hard time with a number of the apprentices who misbehaved, and so at any one time the workshop would have either Bewick or Bewick and Bealby, plus perhaps 3 or 4 apprentices, and they once one graduates, becomes an engraver and works for himself or moves away, and they get 1 or 2 others in. And usually these start as young boys, as Bewick did. So Bewick started as a 14-year-old, and I think one lad came to Bewick younger than 14, which wasn't necessarily what he should have done, but that's Robert Johnson, who was a part of the sort of Bewick family circle. Other people were considerably older and perhaps spent less time in the workshop. There's a very idealized image of what the workshop would like by a Victorian Victorian watercolorist, but it was actually quite hard work. These boys were basically taught to copy, and they were taught to have reliable hand skills. A number of them, John Laws, Luke Clennell, Robert Johnson, William Harvey, were exceptionally talented, and Bewick realised that, and those people had the beginnings of, and his own brother John Bewick. These people had the beginnings of independent careers.
Yeah.
But the workshop also employed at certain times engravers who would arrive and do odd bits of engraving for them on the hoof, and they would also employ printers if there was a need for, because the printing was generally done somewhere else, but if there was a need for printing in the workshop because of whichever commissions they were working on, the printing was done, could be done by printers that he would employ as well. And Bewick's workbooks, which is the sort of engine or the source material that Nigel Tattersfield used in 2011 for his complete illustrative works. Those workbooks are preserved in the Tyningweir Archive and the Ling Art Gallery, and they're a tremendous resource. And one of the things that they're a resource for is the way in which Bewick employed people, paid people, struggled to get debts paid off from people, and fell out with his employees. Some of them have cartoons beside them showing that someone should be whipped or sent to the gallows or such like. But yeah, so there's a wonderful resource with all that detail of how they ran a busy workshop. And the self-published works, the quadrupeds, the birds, Fables of Aesop, those were all produced evenings and weekends. and summer holidays. So they were not produced from the workshop, they were extra. The workshop continued during the production of all those things. The apprentices did work on quite a number of the fables of Aesop, because by then Bewick had been unwell and he was an old man in a hurry. But for the natural history books, as they go through the various editions, that's Bewick working extra hours to do this, and it's a remarkable sort of ambition that he had to do that.
Yeah. So, sounds like quite an industrious chap.
Yes, I mean, just a mad idea. I'll do a book of animals, and the unrealized one was a book of fishes, and which was to be the project handed to his son, and they completed many fishes. I can't remember how many, but more than a handful, 20 or 30, I think. And they have some of the blocks at Cherryburn for the fishes, and they are remarkable. It's a much more difficult thing to illustrate a fish, because it's not in a landscape; it's underwater. But it was an ambitious thing. Bewick didn't live long enough to do dinosaurs, which I always say, but was a great loss to the world of natural history publication. But there we are.
There's one, we're just a shade over time, so we must stop in a second. Quick comment from Heather. Behind St Nicholas Cathedral in Newcastle is a portrait sculpture of Bewick, placed on the wall quite high up, I think.
Yeah, so that's part of the lovely thing you can do. You can walk around Newcastle, and you can place yourself in the 18th century, because the bust is at the point where Bewick's workshop was, and it commemorates the spot. The building itself has vanished, but we know exactly. And it's a very similar layout, except you can't walk in there and order engravings anymore, sadly. But there we are. Yeah.
Great. Well, that's been an extremely interesting session. Thank you both, Peter and Graham, for your input to that and for answering so many questions, as well as your excellent talks and illustrations. Very good session. I look forward to some more sessions next year, 2023. We'll see you then. I'm going to hand back briefly to Claire to wind things up if she's there. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you. So yes, I'll just repeat what John said, really. Thanks very much, Peter and Graham. I've certainly learned a lot this evening that I didn't know 2 hours before. So thanks very much for that. Thank you, John, for chairing the session as always. We'll see you in the new year for our next series of HoPIN events. And thanks for watching. Bye for now. See you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Claire.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you.
Pleasure.